Okay, well, I'm so pleased to be here to join you with your opening conference. So that's a very big event. I can't believe how you manage a group of 70 people. Wow. Good luck. I'm looking forward to learning all about the initiatives you're taking. So specifically, I've taken my cue from your title. We do actually have a PowerPoint here. Change of color. So I've taken the cue from your title, which asks us to think about refigurations. And I'm going to look at that in terms of urbanization, particularly trying to think about new spaces of urban politics. So I think this is also a kind of new initiative for me, bringing a range of different projects together. But I think it's something which I've been wanting to explore for a little while. So I would say the need to rethink urban politics arises partly in response to empirical developments in urbanization. Such as the vast expansion and fragmentation of urban settlements, the dispersal of urban forms over extended urban regions or corridors, and the expanded role of globalized circuits shaping urbanization, such as policy circuits, networks of urban actors, investment flows, which have generated transnational platforms of urban political agency. So the urban is not found in little blobs on the planet, but the urban is super globalized, transnationalized. Where urban politics is in some kind of transnational formation. So that's one of the things we really have to think hard about. Plus, urban politics takes place in all these very dispersed and odd spaces, which are certainly urban, but not flowing out from centers of traditional urban formations. So many of these provocations for urban studies in this regard have come from the insights of planetary urbanization, and this provides an important articulation of the empirical challenge we face, which requires a response in terms of how we think about urban politics. So what we inherit then, what's how I think of our inheritance tracks of urban political analysis in terms of the spaces of them, we could start off with a kind of classic Kevin Cox, David Harvey approach, which looks at municipalities competing for footloose capital, so kind of 70s, 80s moment, and the range of analyses of urban regime politics which formed around those kinds of agendas and other growth agendas. As these largely flowed from the US context. So you have locally dependent municipalities and firms, very locally dependent industries, banks, service providers, and so on. And this configured a certain range of political formations, actors, and interests. Now, these analyses traveled very poorly to Europe. And there were some wider analyses, comparative efforts to expand the range of concerns to consider municipalities in relation also to their national political context and the place of cities in relation to international economic opportunities. Now, the thing is, these approaches traveled even more poorly to a lot of other contexts in the world. In fact, they probably haven't arrived, I would say. Situations where business and other actors are very nationally focused, where local governance systems are strongly centralized, where the institutional basis and scope for local government action is very weak, or highly informalized. Where you have strong transnational actors, such as resource extraction companies, oil companies, mineral companies. You have sovereign development organizations arriving to expand their interests. International NGOs, actors such as the World Bank, for example. These bring very different configurations to urban politics, and we have little broader systematic analysis of that. But a lot of these dimensions, this kind of politics that I've described, which characterizes many poorer countries around the world, it also resonates with the politics from the US. I'm not saying that we throw that out altogether. I found it a very interesting starting point for thinking about city strategies, how many different stakeholders come together, negotiate and formulate perhaps ideas about where the city might be going. Now, the second era and approach which frames the horizon of thinking urban politics is that of neoliberalization. So here are the sources of inspiration for analysis. They've been a bit more self-conscious about not being so very located on the US or Europe and seeing this as a starting point for theorizing. So they have looked more at the dispersed origins and circuits of neoliberal practices, but still less commonly considered in analyses of urban politics through neoliberalization are the experiences of poorer contexts where neoliberalization took place through coercive policy circuits in the name of structural adjustment policy, for example, situations where rollback has not been possible because state-led institutions have never been present or differentially present with a colonial inheritance or very long absent decade, or those where neoliberal innovations have in fact enabled developmental interventions. And the analytical field of urban politics has been pathetic about that because neoliberalism is always bad and something to criticize. And actually, in many contexts, as James Ferguson and others have shown, these technologies can roll out really substantial developmental gains. Now, what's important for what I want to think about today is the territorial configuration of this analysis. So, as many of you will know in their very excellent work, Peck, Theodore, and Brenner bring forward the idea of a syndrome of neoliberalization. So we can see all sorts of different things whizzing about the world, a syndrome, multiplicity of forms of neoliberalization, in which there's no original or pure neoliberalism, but circuits of policy innovation and contradiction, which are shaped by numerous local contexts, which constantly generate hybridized outcomes. So everything's hybridized, in turn reshaping neoliberalized policy circuits. Now, with Suparnell, we plucked up our courage and we sort of took issue with some aspects of this otherwise very good approach. And we've discussed the difficulties of seeing such local hybridizations and experiments as necessarily leading back to the syndrome of neoliberalism. That is, it always goes back and adds to neoliberalism rather than something else. In the examples we looked at, other things happen. You come to a policy dead end, lots of effort and nothing really happens. People appropriate the neoliberalization personally, so Swiss bank accounts get much fuller. And developmental outcomes, as I said, might be there. And we have to ask, along with, in fact, Jamie Peck himself and his co-authors, Helge Leitner and others, when is this no longer neoliberalization? So other kinds of dynamics are important. But now what we have here is a profound sense of urban politics is not confined to the territory of the urban as such, or kind of cities, but operating, for example, in the circuits of policymakers or the circuits of those who direct flows of finance. So, in fact, a very great match for neoliberalization is a huge, voluminous literature emerging on financialization. So, a number of my students are working on this topic. So, financialization takes a similar sort of format. Money zooming around the world, asset managers looking to invest in the city, and some sort of, in fact, we talk less about hybridization, but some sense that there's a sort of complex hybrid form of these financial flows emerging. So there's much to learn from these approaches. Spatial constitution of interests, perhaps in particular territories, motivations of actors, intersections between localities and circulating processes. So they set out the terrain of the problem. How do we think about urban politics in the context of the kind of spatialities that were outlined in the opening lecture? So I want to build on this today. So whereas we take from these earlier literatures, one, politics is kind of organized around municipal or jurisdictional territories, it takes place in circuits as well as in these territories. So I'm going to see where do we go with that? How do we take that forward? And the spirit for taking this forward for me comes out of the work that Philippe was outlining there about a post-colonial critique of inherited concepts in the field. So many of the concepts like that of the competitive urban entrepreneurialism emerge out of certain situations, Europe, North America. So how can we, shift that, start somewhere else? So I put a lot of energy into trying to think about how we transform the wider field of urban studies, one which entails conversations about the horizon of what the urban might be beyond a single case study. So I'm not talking about never having a conversation about what the urban might be. Also one which is able to respond to the intense interconnections which make the urban a transnational and transscalar phenomenon, as much as a multiplicity of specific located outcomes. So I've taken an awful lot of care to develop a reformatted comparative imagination, which articulates the potential to treat concepts, theory, ideas, insights as firstly revisable, so we don't have to take the things we find as the things to think with, we can change them. Or we could start again. We could launch ideas from any particular context. So any urban site is a good place to start building analyses from. And I really think it's quite important to hold on to the idea that the reason for doing this is to contribute also to wider conversations about the urban, at the same time as recognizing that there could be times when close attachments to places mean quite limited scope for translation across divergent contexts. So just to be very clear about my position on these. So I think there are potentially significant disjunctures in the lines of analytical circulation. I'm not suggesting we build one theory for the whole world. There may be many different formulations of the urban, a multiplicity of them. And I have never, and will never, I don't think, suggest that an integrated or universal theorization of the urban is possible. If anyone can find some statement by me on that, right at this moment, quite value it. I don't think I would ever have supported that. I also propose that these divergent conceptualizations of the urban need to be explored without prejudging what the grounds of divergence might be. Many different reasons why you'd have differentiated outcomes in different parts of the world. So quite common is to think about the global south and north distinctions. And my judgment is, while there's a lot of mileage to starting from questioning on that basis, I don't think that really in the long run we find grounds for divergence in thinking along these pre-given lines necessarily. So specifically, I've proposed as a way forward to a more global urban studies, ways to reformat conventional comparative practices by focusing, one, on building on the invitations which the intensely interconnected spatiality of the urban offers us to think across even highly divergent urban contexts. So aspects of these circuits that are shaping the urban zoom all over the world and will connect very different places, as we'll see. Lilongwe and London. Lilongwe is one of the poorest cities in the world in Malawi. London, where I work, always at the top of somebody's tree for a while more. So these circuits generate repeated instances. So as they track around the world, they instantiate examples of, say, satellite cities, office blocks which are leading to good returns for asset managers in the US, and so on. So we have all these repeated instances, and they really invite us to track them, think with them. And then through these repeated instances, or more generally on the basis of shared features, which is a very loose formulation of a diverse urban context, to think with the variety of outcomes. So to be attentive to that variety. So what I'm going to do now is turn to do these two things in terms of trying to think about new territories of urban politics. On the one hand, to think about connections as globalized platforms for urban politics, and to think about the consequences of their territorializations of circuits in terms of transscalar politics. And then I'm going to think also about the second comparative tactic, which is to actually compare different things and see how they can thicken our understanding, how they can enrich our interpretation. So I'm going to take these particular approaches really to thinking about different fragments of the urban which could pitch up new territories being built, a new city within a city, a new satellite city, a new project, a new building. This is one kind of formation or transnational circuits at global level. There are lots of other questions which flow from the empirical complexity of urbanization. And Johanna Herning, who's going to talk to us now about something probably quite different, has some very excellent and interesting work which talks about the politics of alliance building on land-based issues across urban-rural situations, which we shouldn't really use those terms. But I think there are many different questions that arise. So I share with you a few of my own. So the first point is that connections themselves are sites of the urban political. So we saw that in relation to neoliberalization, and more concretely, we've seen a real rise in studies of transnational territories of urban politics, including, for example, the global agency of municipalities, inserting their interests into global policy agendas, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of networking amongst municipalities and other urban agents around many issues, climate change, and so on, which these have been shown to be as much platforms for competition as for collaboration, or for negotiating and circulating new policy norms. And they're very powerful processes which kind of come back at cities from these platforms and institutions, which are processes of disseminating the agendas, the urban agendas of global agencies. So the SDGs are both produced by cities, but then the powerful circuits that reinstall them within different urban contexts need some investigation. So this opens up a lot of opportunities to think about the power relations and dynamics of the urban as globalized circuits and networks. Ideally, we should draw on a diversity of kinds of circuits. So we don't just have circuits which are about neoliberalization, circuits about development, circuits about climate change, finance, and so on. So how do we explore this? This is not something I've spent an awful lot of time doing, but I'd like to offer an example of a kind of transnational circuit which struck me as indicating some of the directions that need to be taken if this literature on transnational politics is going to embrace the diversity of urbanization. So the example, I was working on city strategies, so looking at the London plan, looking at Johannesburg's work on a post-apartheid vision for the city, and Johannesburg officials decided to take a trip to Lilongwe, inspired by the UCLG, United Cities and Local Government, one of the important networks, and join with Lilongwe in supporting officials there to develop a city strategy for that town. It's about 700,000 people at the time. This was 2009 to about 2011. And this really, I was very drawn to this once I started hearing about this from the Johannesburg officials, because it's extremely slow. It took years, back and forth, lots of visits on very little money. Johannesburg just took some money from their operating budget to pop up to Lilongwe to work very closely. So real city-to-city peer learning. And I think this is a very important way in which ideas and practices circulate, and very different from the fast policy analyses of neoliberalization. Now, it came to a bit of a sticky end, so then it's also an interesting example of how policies don't necessarily, make something happen, the sense of political change and sort of some corruption governance issues meant that implementation was not very strong. Johannesburg ended up being sidelined from the initiative, and part of the reason is because this award that is on the bottom of the slide here, personnel change in Lilongwe at the time the city strategy came to an end led to a new city manager applying for this award from Guangzhou for being a very good innovator in urban policy. And the award was given to Lilongwe City Council and the Cities Alliance, who'd offered some initial funding, and Johannesburg wasn't invited, told about it, or anything. So it was kind of grabbed by this for personal advantage. So what this kind of says to me is that when we're looking at the transnationalization of politics, we have to open ourselves to the wide range of political formations that exist across the world, including informalized and potentially quite specular dynamics. So here, the disappearance of this policy into this award recognition becoming important. Now, the thing that struck me here is that this has some very material consequences. So, for example, this award and some of the achievements of the initial collaboration were also banked in organizational terms by development funding groups who put more money into this, on the basis of the city strategy, put more money into Lilongwe, despite all the warning signs about informality, corruption, and lack of capacity to implement. So I think what I'm trying to suggest is that just because when we're talking about transnational processes, we also have to take account of the great diversity of urban politics. And this came home to Joburg in a way, in that what is a more substantial initiative led by the former mayor of Johannesburg to try and bring development into the center of the city around a transit project was kind of launched into the world of awards and recognition before anything much had happened. So is a sort of a sense that there's a specularity and an informality to transnational urban politics. Then this is not to other Lilongwe and Johannesburg. In fact, I have a paper which I wrote up trying to bring these three cases together, which finds within the London process the relevance of highly informalized practices of urban governance. So it was interesting for me to see also the specularity of governance in the London context. So there's quite a lot of things to think about there in terms of how we can learn from different contexts to expand our registers of interpretation of urban politics in other places. So if I turn then to the question of what I call here territorialized transscalar agency. So what happens to a world of urban politics that's at once transscalar, involving many globalized actors, and organized around territories, happening in particular places, often quite delimited? So multiple globalizing circuits shape the future trajectories of urban settlements, many different practices. And it gives us an iconic understanding of this, perhaps sees us looking at cities which have many similar things in them, you know, so the same kind of building is built all over the show. Identical urban forms might emerge, the serially reproduced satellite city, the borrowed concept or design. However, the thing that interests me, we were doing some work on a very large-scale development in London, and each one of these apparently identical buildings, which conforms to some so-called London vernacular style, they all look not terribly vernacular. I think they have bricks that may feel very similar to those in other buildings in London. But each of these identical buildings needs 2 or 3 years of weekly meetings between the planners and the developers to design them and to agree on the format. So there's a kind of tension between the fact that many of these developments in London, as we know, are driven by very substantial global investors and financial agents, and yet in this nitty-gritty, week-by-week discussion of how our buildings should look. So what do we make of this? I think what this makes me think is that we need to focus again on the territory, but in a new way. So a lot of the work about financialization, for example, returns in the same way as neoliberalization does, returns each of these experiences of investment to a wider story about financialization. But what I think we forget about looking at, we haven't really paid a great deal of attention to the nature of the urban territories being produced. So what is the territorial foundation of urban politics in this transnationalized space? And what is the nature of the politics that's transacted there? What is happening between these globally transnational actors, these policymakers who are also highly transnationalized and organized around a particular territory? So first of all, I think it's helpful to identify what is the instance that's emerging out of the circuits of urbanization. So this could be the buildings, for example, in which certain forms of financialized capital are very invested because they want to have these kind of patient returns from the rental stream. So it could be the buildings, it could be whole new cities, satellite cities, which are being built, huge interventions in the urban. And we have to keep in mind that these interventions are not only the purview of developers, states, or consultants, and so on, but they're also generating a lot of activity amongst often very poor people who are trying to position themselves in relation to these initiatives, moving residents, trying to organize land claims, trying to see what kind of opportunities might be there. And I wish to channel my inner Malik Simone, but fail miserably. So how do we sort of think about these conglomerations, these settings in which a range of transscalar actors and networks are territorialized in cooperation and contestation, and very creative production of new urban territories, for example. And here my favorite thing at the moment comes from Ludovic Albert and, can't remember her name, Rouanet, working on Bangladesh, but many other cases. And he, in trying to think about this tension between profoundly translocalized practice circuits influencing new developments and their intense territorialization around the building, the project, the city, he develops this idea of transscalar territorial networks. I think this is, for me, a very interesting formulation to explain how resources from multiple horizons are pulled together in a given business property development, from a fixed plot of land to a capital allocated in distant investment committee boardrooms. We also can reach here to Alan and Cochrane's interesting ideas about regional assemblages, where instead of scales, we look at how many different institutions are all operating in different ways within certain territories, having a patchwork of overlapping territorializations. So across a range of territories, extended and city regional configurations, corridors, dispersed fragments of the urban, political formations are assembled out of diverse actors operating with varied reach, capacity, and transscalar competencies. So in that context, how do we characterize the interests, the nature of the actors, the political dynamics? Is it just the same old thing? Do we have the state plus the developer plus, are these the same old actors? Or does something else happen in this somewhat I think of it as a kind of transscalar torsion. Something goes on there. So we'll come to that in a minute. The final resource for thinking about the territorial relationship takes its cue from regulation theory. And this is quite a long quote, but I'll just talk about, just cite the first sentence. The territorial relationship, rapport territorial, generates a contradictory and complex system of dependencies, jurisdictions, and rules. Dynamic, changing, historically dynamic, a framework of rules which emerge within a context. And in the way that the urban is often very unclear to us, the formats of regulation, the dynamics and customs and conventions, which are this is very clear in, these processes of negotiations between states and developers. These are not very comprehensible. They're not written down. Nobody can tell you on what basis a negotiation is going to succeed. These are emergent conventions of action. So I'm suggesting that the territorial grounds for urban politics could be conceived as emergent territorializations, embracing transscalar territorial networks which constellate around designated urban projects and programs alongside the complex formations associated with territorial regulation. So we have a very different potential then to think about the territories of urban politics. Rather than competing municipalities and footloose capital, we acknowledge the emergence of these new territories on which urban politics is constituted. So I have very light examples because there's not really time to explore this in much detail. But I've been doing a comparative project, and we'll come to the three cases together at the end between Shanghai, Johannesburg, and London, with colleagues Fulong Wu and working on Lingang in Shanghai, and Phil Harrison on the corridors of freedom in Johannesburg. Now, this is a picture of Lingang New City, which is if you look at your map over there, the very far right-hand orange blob. There's one of 9 new cities around Shanghai. They've reduced them to, I think, 5 now. But this is an initiative to bring forward restructuring and upgrading of Shanghai's economic capacity by stimulating equipment manufacturing. There's also a new deep port development, which is quite impressive, 32-kilometer bridge leading to a couple of tiny little islands, now having a huge operation with the largest ships available in the world and containers and so on. So this is a very big initiative, and I'll just share with you the one thing which captures something of this. How do we think about the local-global formulation? And it's not a new kind of problem. We think of Swingado's term glocal, only to realize we've been grappling this for some time. But in this case, this is an unusual design for the center of the city of Lingang, which has got a lake, a huge lake. I think it's about 5 kilometers in diameter. And it's got some kind of rhetoric about it. The whole city structure is based on the metaphor of an image of concentric ripples formed by a drop falling into water. Very whimsical. So this is designed ostensibly by GMP, a German-based architectural practice with some offices across China. And in a way, then you might read this as a kind of international consulting firm imposing its architecture or being brought in, and its architecture being imposed. But if we look at what was interesting to me was that the competition for winning the tender to design the city was held amongst Chinese, basically state entities competing to be the ones to bring forward the right design. So the way to bring forward the right design was to have something dramatic, something international, something feeding into Shanghai's global agenda. So in a way, this very so-called international referencing new towns and garden cities and so on was the product of a very locally based, competitive, dynamic to win the tender. In fact, it's a bit of a disaster because it's such a huge scale. It's not a great success in terms of urbanism. So why does the second case comes from our own the case study I've been working most closely on in London. So this is one of the developers in this huge 30,000 homes, 60,000 jobs kind of development in northwest London. This was one of the developers said. We said, well, what do you really want to do with this development? We expected the developer to say, oh, well, we're going to make a lot of money, and so on. No, he says, I want people to be happy. That's the vision. Wow, that's a funny thing to say. To build something that people look back in years and say, wow, that's the right way to do development. So this would be between 6,000 and 9,000 homes by one single landowner and a very large, more or less private equity developer in London. And it was interesting to us because we found time and time again in talking to the developers, the consultants, the architects, is that while this is seemingly a globalized process, many of these very global firms and others were very invested in London. They were very interested in making a nice place in London. They were very knowledgeable and networked. It was their networks in that local place that brought them into the development process. So I think what matters about the complexity of the positions that we're seeing across so-called global local is that the old oppositions of kind of jurisdictionally based political interests versus globally powerful investors behind some wall of money, I think we have to give ourselves some space to think about how these territorialized formations of embedded and differentiated concerns of actors arise, so that you might find the localization processes of developers finding their way to work in particular contexts define perhaps a different interest construction. I'm not saying they always do, because there are plenty of developers in our case study who are pushing things higher. But as we'll see in a minute, the state in fact, has a much stronger interest in development than the developers, ironically, in this case. So the final example of the transscaler that I wanted to put out takes our cue from some really provocative statement from Edgar Peterser, who was speaking later in the week, Sue Parnell and Haysom, sorry, I don't know his name, this great paper, African Dreams. And they say over the next decade, academic thinking on urban life and infrastructure is likely to flow from and or critique the Sustainable Development Goals, aspiration for cities in general, the African city in particular. So here, the idea that the new territories of urban politics, the territories literally of inspiration coming from the experiences of implementing the SDGs across Africa. So the thing that's interesting to me is that often within this the discourse of the Sustainable Development Goals implementation, the view of urban development and urban governance is quite static and a little old-fashioned. Multi-level governance, effective multi-level governance, participation of local communities, blah, blah, blah. So this is somewhat at odds with the nature of the beast of urbanization and urban development in African cities. So who's involved there? The Chinese, sovereign development organizations, massive private sector investment, only going to get worse with the SDGs. Here's Citibank saying they're going to be the bank for the SDGs. Huge private sector investment in some of the poorest places across the continent. And the developmental investment that is being pushed by a number of international and donor organizations. So while I think that Sue and Edgar and so on are surely correct that the SDGs will provide a large platform of urban research and theorizing over the next decade, I think we need perhaps to take some inspiration from the transscaler formations of urban politics for some more exploratory thinking about what the nature of politics is in urban development and what interventions might be. So if the politics is happening in these settings between transscaler configured actors who may not be what they seem to be in terms of their initial definition, then perhaps the kinds of city-based or local government-oriented interjurisdictional good governance development agendas could be, one doesn't want to say they shouldn't happen, but they could go alongside closer attention to the transscaler territories and the potential for governance interventions that might yield sites of support and transparency, which could improve outcomes significantly, extending understandings of the interests of the actors involved in these territorialized formations of transscaler development, and with a view to yielding stronger public benefit from these investments which are taking place all over the continent. And for myself, when I was doing some preparation for a grant application, so who knows whether this will ever take off, but here's an example of a Transscaler alliance to bring forward. This was investment from the Japanese. And you see a number of ministers of local government, of aid and debt, of transport and so on. The Japanese leader of the study team from JICA, their development agency, and also the Lilongwe chief executive officer for the city, highly incapacitated urban context. So there's an interesting alliance there. And what would be the effective potential for governance gains by targeting certain capacities which could mobilize some of the benefits of these investments? So I'll finish off 5 minutes, 3 minutes, okay. So finally, the initiative, which is really the one that I'm puzzling over quite a lot. So I think everyone's happy to hear about transnational circuits and Transscaler, blah, blah, blah. But when you want to sort of jump into thinking, how can we compare the very particular outcomes across places, which are so often really strikingly different, it's hard to make that case. We can't say we're comparing different cities. We can't say we're comparing local places or whatever. So how can we use these kind of Transscaler territorial formations to compose comparative initiatives? So I've been very inspired by another piece of work, which is from Gavin Shatkin. He studied large-scale developments in Jakarta, Chongqing, and Delhi, so Indonesia, China, and India. And he starts then from these Asian contexts to think about the politics of urban development, what he calls a real estate turn, looking at how the rent gap is captured in each of these contexts for mega urban projects. And in fact, the politics across these cases is very diverse. But what he draws on in his analysis is based on the experience of Asian contexts, which is things that have been very absent from our theorizing to date. So questions of strong or peremptory state intervention, state control over land, or state willingness to displace communities from traditional land entitlements, a range of authoritarian and informal states. So he starts a process of theorization which is inspired by these contexts, which asks us to look in a different direction than we've been looking perhaps with some of the theoretical repertoires we've had before. So what I have found very interesting is to take his concern about questions of states that have more or less control of land. So the classic situation in China, the state has a lot of control of land. They have a lot of autonomy. Nobody's going to come and stop the Chinese state grabbing a bunch of land and developing it, okay? But other places have less state control, less levers for controlling the land, and perhaps less autonomy. That is, there's politics, protests, democracy, lines of influence on them. And I've been quite interested in the fact of the bottom right-hand quadrant of his analysis there, which said he doesn't know what would fit into that quadrant, having more state control of land and less autonomy. And as I was reading his book and thinking about our case in London, it struck me that here we have a situation, the state doesn't own a lot of land, although it does own a fair amount of land, in fact. But it has a lot of control over development management, over the rights to develop the land. In the UK and in a number of other African and ex-colonial contexts, actually, that capacity is quite powerful. But the state land managers are not so autonomous. That is, despite all the secrecy and post-politics and so on, actually, there's some purchase on what the state does. So I've been thinking of reading London through that lens, which takes me back to the developer who said he wants to make a nice development where people will be happy to live and say good things about him as a developer and his development. And actually, in case after case in our study, we found the local planners pushing the development higher, wanting more high-end properties, wanting more money to extract for infrastructure development. And basically, we have a situation where, as we think across our three cases, which I'll do very quickly now in my minus 30 seconds that I have, so starting from this theorization inspired by the Asian context, so the bottom right-hand is the northwest London. This is one of the first images of that place, the corridors of freedom in Joburg and Lingang. So we are drawn to focus more closely on the interests of the state itself and land value capture. So the Asian case really nails that issue. It's often occluded in the UK context. We moan and moan about the developers coming to steal our land, build high things, not make public spaces, etc. But in fact, what is the state's interest in this? And the diversity of political and financial models for urban development should focus our minds, because why do we do this to ourselves, is my question. So this is, I'll just leave this here for you, because by approaching the question of state interest in urban development and land value capture from these transscalar territorial formations, what we see are not financialization hitting the ground and eating up cities and ruining our lives because of a wall of money, but we see 3 different business models for organizing urban development. Johannesburg, I'm a bit biased, has a great model. So they have a very blended property and land tax, which yields resources to the city from all the development across the municipality, which then can be strategically invested in this and that, what they decide to do politically. That's pretty good. It rests on trying to minimize land values to bring in low-income housing to the center of the city. London establishes a little red line around all sorts of bits of the city, calls them opportunity areas, and says they must finance themselves. So this really pushes for the state to extract a lot of value, to build railway lines, to put in stations, to pay for all the social infrastructure, to pay for education, social housing, and healthcare, and so on. So this is very intense. And then the final model we see is in Lingang in Shanghai. It's not completely typical of the Chinese case, but here the municipality has put up land for the economic development to take place, and they are anticipating getting tax revenue back from the businesses, and in the long term this will enable them to recoup their costs and investment. There's also a bit of a wider land business trying to reinforce the profitability of the state-owned enterprises, and then a lot of other complicated financial arrangements, very few of which actually fit with the financialization model. So what I see then, what we've learned from our comparative exercise across territories, is the scope to reconfigure business models. And this, I think, has been a very interesting thing for us as we've worked on it. So I hope that I've indicated the rich potential for analyses to both stretch the territories from which urban politics can be theorized, whether this is Lilongwe or Lingang, and to indicate the scope to expand our insights into the emerging, if not new, territorializations of urban politics. Thank you.